Chapter 57, Liberation of France, mid-1940s, Bedpan Commando, our medical corpsman. A bedpan commando helped the men who couldn't help themselves. 7 weeks after the D-Day landings, Operation Cobra began an offensive on July 25, 1944, with a concentrated aerial bombardment from thousands of aircraft. The Allied forces emerged from the hedgerows and began a westward movement in hope of overrunning the Germans and liberating all the region known as Brittany. The German army was undersupplied and unable to hold a unified front line. The hedges, once held by the Germans, were abandoned as they attempted to retreat, but were being slaughtered by aircraft, tanks, and artillery. Pressing eastward, an estimated 600 tons of bombs were dropped on German positions. The elite Panzer-Lehr division was reduced to only 1/3 by the casualties. The American 4th, 9th, and 30th Infantry Divisions charged into German lines, where the few Germans who were encountered were often out of their heads with shock from the bombing. Earl said that some of them came running toward the Americans, screaming and crying from the shell shock they had experienced. The trauma of war was taking its toll on both sides. The American 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Armored Divisions, supported by the 1st Infantry Division, charged through the gap created. The German forces, already ill-equipped due to the Allied air superiority and struck in days from the bombardment, fell back 12 miles by the end of July 28th. The Germans were then on a general retreat to regroup. Their defeat had cost them over 400,000 men, and Brittany was now in Allied hands. The forward momentum of the Allied army had become obvious, and territories that the Germans had conquered were abandoned. The German Führer Adolf Hitler was intent on pushing the Allied army back, although his generals believed they could not win. On the night of August 6-7, the Germans attempted a surprise attack, but British intelligence decoders had intercepted and decrypted the orders, and were able to get air support from both the U.S. 9th Air Force and the British Royal Air Force. The resilience of the Allied troops and their superior air support turned the Germans back in the next 2 weeks of fighting. 150,000 Germans surrendered by the 21st of August. An estimated 100,000 German troops escaped and retreated to Germany. The Canadian troops suffered the heaviest casualty on the Allied side. A Canadian soldier, Robert Rugg, described the carnage he saw afterward in the Battle of the Falaise Pocket, August 7-22, 1944. It reeked of the destroyed German army. Burned-out tanks, lorries, motorcycles, and carts were in ruinous heaps. Bloated, black-faced corpses lay everywhere, and the summer stench was overpowering. Dead, grossly swollen horses were carelessly mingled with human corpses and savaged equipment. The men held dirty handkerchiefs over their faces, but nothing could keep out the stench. It got into their clothes and remained with them for days. The southern flank was where Earl's unit was benefited from the swift movement and strength of General Patton's forces. He said that they were able to get onto trucks and ride on roads. It was such a relief from the slow advancement they had made on foot. The front line with the Germans was now undefined, and it gave them some reprieve from what they had endured. Earl said that the Germans couldn't retreat by day because the airstrikes would destroy them. So they tried to move at night, but the planes dropped flares to light up the night sky and reveal their attempts to escape. The German rear guard was the only resistance they met as they pushed the Germans into retreat. The long trip to Paris by the Allied forces was achieved in mid-August. Some of the troops received a military paper called the Stars and Stripes, giving them updates about the war effort elsewhere. Some mail for the troops also was delivered so that they got news from home. It was good to hear from family and about the war efforts abroad. The enemy was being pushed back, and there was hope that a defeat or surrender would come soon. Back in America, the war effort was in full production. Making the supplies and equipment needed for the war gave jobs to many who hadn't had a decent job in many years. All had a spirit of support for the troops, and over 16 million Americans would give military service. The capital city of France had been ruled by Nazi Germany ever since June 22, 1940. For over 4 years, Parisians had suffered the horrible invasion of the Germans. French resistance staged an uprising against the German garrison on August 19th as General George Patton approached with the Third Army. The 2nd Armored Division and the 4th Infantry Division entered Paris on the 25th, and the Germans surrendered. French General Charles de Gaulle assumed control of the city, and Hitler was outraged that his command had failed to defend or destroy the city upon their retreat. The battle for Paris had lasted for only 7 days, as victory parades then ensued with French and Allied forces marched to the cheers of Parisians. How encouraging it must have been for Sergeant Earl Harness to feel the love and appreciation of the country he had been defending, as emotional bystanders on sidewalks cheered him and his comrades for their sacrifice to liberate their city. He had now been involved in the battle for France for 80 days. Yet the war was far from being over, as the Germans had retreated and would then push back in a huge effort to change the course of their defeat. The temperatures in France in the late summer month of September and the fall months of October and November are normally very favorable. Earl's division, 4th Infantry, did not tarry in Paris, but pressed on toward the small country of Belgium, which was over 100 miles to the northwest. The longest battle that the U.S. has ever fought to date ensued on September 19, 1944, and lasted until the 16th day of December for a total of 8 days, known as the Hurtgen Forest Battle. In the 1930s, the Germans had built the Siegfried Line, known as the West Wall, which stretched nearly 400 miles along Germany's west side. More than 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, and tank traps were constructed to defend its western border. The Aachen Gap was the logical route into Germany's Rhineland, but Hitler had concentrated his defenses to protect any invasion into the homeland. An estimated 120,000 troops plus reinforcements on the American side were committed to the heavy forested area to engage the Germans. 24,000 American soldiers were killed in the long battle, and another 9,000 perished from exposure, disease, and accidents. Earl said cold and snow made for a very long winter as they battled with the Germans. He said that the pillboxes, concrete bunkers, gave the Germans the advantage of protection from gunfire, but the Americans, using flamethrowers directing fire into the access, overcame them. The captured pillboxes were used for first aid stations and protection from bombing and shelling. Earl said it felt safe being in the captured German bunkers. The Germans launched a last-ditch attempt to reverse the war on the Western Front. The line of conflict between the two sides had a bulge when viewed on a map. Thus, the counteroffense, known as the Battle of the Bulge, began. Reflection. Earl realized day by day that God had kept him alive and well. He had been unwilling to pray aloud in front of others, but he made a promise to God that if he would allow him to return home safely, that he would pray aloud when called upon. It was a small step for him toward becoming a professing believer. Often, the things we fear in life later become so small and seemingly foolish once we witness how we had made them so difficult in our mind. The Apostle Paul wrote these words about his own struggles. But God said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." 2 Corinthians 12:10.